This lecture is about life history characteristics. By the end of this, you should be able to explain the variety of life history variations found in the natural world and evaluate life history traits in terms of trade-offs, because a lot of what ecology is all about trade-offs. You're going to be able to predict changes in life history traits when the environmental conditions change and apply the concepts of life history theory to population ecology theory, and more specifically to the theory of population growth, the logistic and exponential growth models. So what is life history, and what are life history traits? So when we talk about life history of organisms, we're really talking about the lifelong patterns of reproduction and growth. And we always have to remember that traits are the product of evolution, and they're the traits that are the product of evolution in the past. And the habitat of an organism affects its life history traits. That's the ecology of the organism. Now remember, traits are not perfect solutions. It's important for you to remember, especially if you remember when we were talking about evolution, that when we're talking about solutions, if we say anything is perfect, we're implying intent. Traits aren't perfect solutions. They're simply what was most successful for past descendants. If we understand the life history of an organism, we can understand how the population can grow. It also helps us to understand the ecology of the organism. Also remember that the ultimate fitness is having as many offspring as possible. You win the game if you get your genes out into the next generation. Now, survival is important, but only important in so much as you survive to have offspring. But really, you're just trying to get your offspring out. Now, there are many different ways to get as many of your genes out as possible, and we're going to explore several different ways. Just remember that there's no one best way. So again, it depends on the habitat of the organism and the physiology of the organism and the evolution of the organism. So one of the more important principles in ecology is called the principle of allocation. This simply says that natural selection results in each organism optimizing the partitioning of its resources to maximize fitness. In more simple terms, the principle of allocation deals with the idea that there's only so much energy going into an organism. They have to, and they don't do it, it's not like it's a choice, but it's more that natural history hones the life history of the organism so that it partitions the resources, or it partitions the energy into the resources it needs. And so it's going to maximize fitness. Organisms want to maximize fitness, so they maximize reproduction. I think you can think about it like this. If you have a household budget, you have only so much money coming in. You have a finite amount of resources coming into your household, and you have to divvy that money up. You want to maximize some aspects of your budget and minimize others. And whenever you make a choice to, say, raise the proportion of allocation to one budget, say entertainment, you have to take it away from something else, say like food. It's the same thing with organisms. Organisms are limited in the time they have and in the energy they have, which means that there's trade-offs. In life history characteristics, there are always a lot of trade-offs. Organisms have a finite amount of resources, so how do they allocate those resources? And so this is just an example of a general organism where a lot of the energy of this organism goes into food acquisition. Again, reproduction, the organism, because it wants to increase its fitness, wants to maximize the reproduction. But you also have to put some energy into maintenance. Maintenance is just the energy you need just for daily living. You burn calories every day. You need a certain amount of energy, even if you don't move. And then defense. You want to be able to defend against enemies. So again, organisms are limited. They have limited time. They have limited energy, and they're limited in nutrients. There's a difference between energy and nutrients. When I talk about nutrients, what I'm talking about are simply those atoms like nitrogen and phosphorus, which we don't need in a tremendously large amount, but they're absolutely necessary for life. In energy, I'm talking more about food energy. And trade-offs, this is basically the definition of a trade-off. an increase in one life history trait leads to a decrease in another. That is the very definition of trade-off. So if you're going to increase one aspect of your life history, another aspect has to be decreased because there's limited time, energy, nutrients. So some of the common life history traits we're going to be looking at. Size, how big of an organism, do you grow, do you not grow? Growth, grow or reproduce, reproductive strategies. There's always a cost of reproduction. So we're going to be looking at some of those costs, and the number and fitness of offspring. So the first one we're going to look at is size. So is it better to be bigger? Now, in general, within a population, and I'm talking all the same species, right? So you're in a population. Is it better to be a bigger individual? Well, there's a trade-off associated with size. So the advantage is that larger individuals, in general, have more offspring. So if you grow bigger, potentially you can increase your fitness. Now, the downside is that it makes you more vulnerable to predation and also to environmental problems like food scarcity. It costs more for production and it costs more for maintenance. You have to put a lot more energy into looking for food because you need more food to sustain your body. Although organisms must put some effort into living, evolution depends on passing on your genetic material. So that tension between those two, that you have to live in order to reproduce, is a source of so many of the trade-offs associated with life history traits. Let's look at metamorphosis. So a lot of organisms undergo metamorphosis, and metamorphosis is a term that also has some variability in it. There are some organisms that have complete metamorphosis, like butterflies, where the larval stage, which we commonly call the caterpillar, looks very different from the adult stage. And then there's incomplete metamorphosis with, say, crickets, where the juvenile stage looks very similar to the adult stage, it's just not as mature. So let's look at some of the pros and cons of metamorphosis. It's an incredibly successful strategy and it's been around for a long time and it continues to persist because it does have some big pros. So one of the biggest is that it can exploit different niches and environments in the course of a lifespan. So this goes along with the last one. It allows for specialized stages. And the middle one, you can avoid periodic unfavorable conditions. If we look at the example of a butterfly, so let's look at, say, some of our local butterflies, some of our small blue butterflies. They, over the winter, during the rainy season and the driest parts of the summer season and into the fall, go into a resting stage, and that stage is as a larva. When they emerge from that stage, they're still a larva, and this is when their host plants, whether they be annual plants or perennial plants, are putting all of their energy into growth. And so they're putting a lot of energy into making the green parts of the plant. And so the job of a larva is simply to eat. It's an eating machine, and that's what it's designed for. That's what it looks like. It doesn't have wings. It doesn't have any wasted parts. And all it has to do is eat. Now, when the plant turns its attention from growth to reproduction and starts to put its energy into flowering, that's when most of these butterflies will turn. So they'll pupate. So they'll go into the chrysalis stage and they'll pupate. It's a resting stage, but then they'll become an adult. Now, an adult butterfly, all it's got to do is fly and mate. And so it is designed for that. It's specialized for mating. Very colorful, it can fly. Some butterfly adults don't even eat. Some just take a little bit of nectar, but the most of their eating is done in the larval stage. And so this is highly specialized. And then when the weather turns bad for them, they simply, they'll lay their eggs and develop into larvae, and then they'll go into a resting stage. So it's a very successful strategy. Now, some of the cons is that it is very complex, a lot of genetic and physiological complexity. A lot can go wrong, especially when you're undergoing complete metamorphosis. And you have those resting stages. Those resting stages are very vulnerable stages. When a butterfly is pupating, that is it is a very vulnerable stage. Let's go back, the slowdown in the animal's metabolic rate. So seeds are actually a resting state in plants. So the seed stage is a resting stage, especially for those seeds with a seed coat. So there's food inside that seed. If you were to take a seed and you were to put it on, say, a paper towel, and you were just to wet it, that seed would grow, and it would grow roots, and it might even grow a few leaves, and it could grow, depending on the size of the seed, pretty large, because that seed is a resting stage, and when it grows, there's food in there for the plant itself. Now, by us, some plants like this lupinus bicolor, require some cue for the seed to germinate. And in this case, scarification, which just means the integrity of the seed coat has to be broken. These are species that are very adapted to living in disturbance areas. So they wait for a disturbance to open up an area, and usually that's, movement of rocks, and it can scarify the seeds. And so that is a strategy for plants. There are other cues for seeds to germinate. Some seeds germinate after a fire, say, or some germinate after they've been soaked in water for a certain period of time. Spores and fungi and bacteria are just like seeds. So reproduction. When we're talking about reproduction, we can talk about asexual reproduction or sexual reproduction. Now, asexual reproduction means that an organism reproduces by itself. And there's many ways that organisms do this. You can just have the budding off. You can have organisms undergo what we call parthenogenesis, where they have offspring. So there are sharks in captivity, or I think it's only one shark, but there has been known to do this, that give birth, even though it is never mated. So there are many strategies for asexual reproduction. We're not going to go through all of them. But what are the advantages? So obviously there are advantages because quite a few organisms have the capacity to undergo sexual reproduction. So the pro. First of all, you don't have to find a mate. And that's a big one, especially if you're in an area where resources are scarce or they're widely distributed, or you need a very specific environment in order to grow. It can be very hard to find a mate. Also, these populations can reproduce quickly because everybody's reproducing. And so this can be a real advantage if it's a population that has to exploit a certain habitat, and then they can just grow really quickly. And also there's fewer steps to reproduction, so there's less of a chance of something going wrong because it's simpler. It's a much simpler way of reproducing. However, there are disadvantages, and the biggest one is no mixing of genetic material. So it really limits the ability of the organism to evolve through natural selection or through sexual selection or non-random mating. At sexual reproduction, it's just the opposite. So the advantage, and this is a huge advantage, is genetic mixing. So evolution is much easier. You're able to remove deleterious alleles, and what that means is that if, say, there's an allele that causes a disease, and if it causes it pre-reproduction, you can get that allele out of the population very quickly. Also, sexual reproduction often arises in lineages basically to escape from parasites. And so organisms, in order to escape from the parasites, you can have natural selection act on variations in that population that are better able to escape from the parasite. So it's a really powerful mode of reproduction. And in almost every lineage, I can only think of one where it didn't happen, but that organisms move towards some sort of sexual reproduction over the course of their evolutionary history. The cons, so of course there's disadvantages, and some of the disadvantages may be it's hard to find mates. So again, you have to find a mate for sexual reproduction. And only half the population can gestate the offspring. So the population grows much more slowly. Reproduction can be very complex, especially the formation of what we call gametes or sex cells, sperm and eggs. And so that can be very complex, and a lot can go wrong. And so it's not perfect, but it's by far, for many organisms, it has a lot of advantages. And then there are the hermaphrodites. Hermaphrodites are organisms that have male and female parts. Now, there's many ways to be hermaphroditic. So there are some organisms like fish that can switch. not all fish, but some fish are sequential hermaphrodites. So you may start out your life as a male and switch to female later in life. Or it could be an environmental cue. So you could start out as a male, and if you just run into too many males, you may switch to female because that would be to your advantage. There are others like plants that are hermaphroditic at the same time, but have certain mechanisms to prevent themselves from self-fertilizing unless they're unable to fertilize sexually. So the pros, you have advantages of both sexual and asexual reproduction, right? You can do it all. In the absence of finding a partner, you can undergo asexual reproduction. Now, there are some hermaphroditic species that have ways of preventing that, but for the most part, that's the advantage. Con, it's very hard to specialize, and so you don't have this sexual dimorphism that attracts sexual selection. So you're not going to get really heavy sexual selection, which can lead to evolutionary changes. Many hermaphroditic species will reproduce sexually whenever possible, because there is a big advantage to sexual reproduction. And this is a banana slug, a picture. And in here they have both male and female parts, and they actually will, when they mate, transfer sperm to each other. And banana slugs are interesting because they have a very interesting reproduction. And this is up for debate about why they do this, but I'll just let you know the behavior. So first of all, banana slugs and all slugs, when they mate, do this. They both transfer sperm to each other. So they have both male and female parts. Slugs tend to have, especially the banana slug, has a very large penis. And sometimes when it's not terribly common, but it happens, and I believe it's about 10% of the time, after they mate, one or both will eat the penis off the other. And there's debate about why they do that. One reason may be because of sexual conflict. That if you are quicker and you can eat the penis off of your partner and then get away, you've just created, in essence, a female. And so you are both male and female, but you've created a functionally female banana slug. And so that could increase your chances of mating in the future. Other people say it may be for nutrition. Other people say it may be because their penises are so large that they get stuck and that they have to chew them off in order to complete mating. And they don't grow back once they're chewed off. So another life history characteristic is growth. Now remember that principle of allocation, there's only so much energy an organism has. And so they can grow or reproduce. And I'm talking about in any given year. So in any given time period, you only have so much energy during your growing season. And you can either put the majority of that energy into growth, or you can put that majority of that energy into reproduction. So the pros, well, larger individuals produce larger and or more young. And so if, say, you are an organism that lives many years, and you even have multiple reproductive events in your life, if you forego reproduction this year, you can put that energy into growth, and next year you can be even bigger and have more offspring. And that can be a really good thing. It also, though, has a risk, because you may forego future reproduction if you don't make it to the next year. So that is a really big con to this. And this one. So this one says for any individual in any given year, right, there's a tension between growth and reproduction. In this one, it says the larger females in a population have more offspring. They go together, but don't be confused. One's a positive correlation, one's a negative. Another example is scorpions. Scorpions have live birth, and a female will carry her offspring on her back. Now, ignore the middle one. This was a study that looked at different species in different habitats. But for the most part, it follows the same theory, the one on the left and the one on the right. So carapace length, this measure right here, is the length of the back. So it's this back part of the scorpion, and that is a measure of size. And litter, we call it a litter because she's having live birth. So she has multiple offspring in a live birth. If she were laying eggs, we'd call it a clutch. But because she's having live birth, we call it a litter. So here it shows the bigger the female, the more offspring she has. And same for this species. The bigger the female, the more offspring. To the semiparous species, they have a lot of offspring. And this strategy is you have a lot of offspring and you don't take care of them, but at least some are going to survive to the next generation. This one says, no, we're only going to have a few, one or a few, and we're going to really take care of them to make sure those survive. If you remember back to, we talked about the those survivorship curves. This would be your classic type 1. Semiparous would be your classic type 3. And it's not that one is better than another. So one is not better than another. It's just that there are different ways to get to the same place, because the place you want to get to is to maximize your fitness. And to get to that place, you can take different roads. And so you can either be semiparous or heteroparous. So when is it best to reproduce? So you can reproduce late in life, right? And if you reproduce late in life, you have less time to reproduce, but you've increased chance of survival. Your offspring do, because you're just bigger and you have more energy at that point. If you reproduce early in life, especially for semiparous species, you may have more time to reproduce, but less of a chance of survival. What about the number of offspring? So again, for organisms, is it better to have a few larger offspring, where those fewer offspring will have a better chance of survival? Or is it better to have more offspring that are smaller, more likely to have some survive? So we can think about this in organisms that have litters, or you can think about it in humans. So if a woman has one baby, that baby's going to be bigger and have a higher chance of survival. If she has triplets, each individual triplet is going to be smaller and have a lower chance of survival. And in fact, the more babies in a single birth, the lower the chance of survival. And that's just, you only have so much energy to give. And so you can either split it among many, or you can, lump it all into a few. And so it's the same with organisms. In fact, I don't have the graph, but some of the information is very useful in agriculture, in, say, pig farming, where pigs produce litters, and farmers will determine the ideal number based on the size of the mother of piglets she should have. And so we'll choose that number as as the litter size. So she has the maximum chance of gestating and having those piglets survive. So these are wood rats, also known as pack rats. They have litters, multiple live birth, multiple offspring. And the larger the litter size, the more young they have in any one reproductive event, the lower the birth weight of each individual pup that they have. Plants, it works with plants as well. And so here we're going to say that plants, the parental care that they're going to give is the seed mass. So the bigger the seed, the fewer seeds a plant will have. And this cuts across several families. I mean, it's just kind of a truism. Plants that produce larger seeds tend to produce fewer seeds. You can think about coconuts. If you produce a coconut, you're not going to produce very many. So this just shows the relationship in lizards. And all of these are measures of egg size. And this is clutch size. Remember, when you lay eggs, multiple eggs at one time, you call it a clutch. If you have live birth, you call it a litter. So the larger the clutch, in almost all of these measures of size of individual eggs, the larger the clutch, the smaller each individual egg is. So this is looking at western fence lizards by us, and these are looking at two different populations, California and Washington. And in here you can see that the California, on average, the hatchlings, so the lizards are born and they hatch out of eggs. The hatchlings are larger, on average, than the hatchlings in Washington state. So these are natural populations. The original California produced smaller clutches of larger eggs. In Washington, they produce larger clutches of smaller eggs. You can surmise that the predation pressure is greater in one of these populations. You should be able to guess which one that is. And so the way they measured this was they experimentally took yolk out of the lizard eggs, to decrease the size, and that was a simulation of clutch size. And what they found was just that the size of the hatchling reduced when they reduced the size of the egg. So in plants, one way to increase fitness of your offspring is to produce larger seeds. So the most precarious stage in plants tends to be the seedling stage. If you can get past the seedling stage, usually you're going to grow on to an adult stage. And being an adult is more stable, and being a seed is a resting stage. That's much more stable. And so the bigger the seed, the bigger the seedling, and the more chance they have of survival. Another way to, if you're a plant, to have parental care is to invest in dispersal mechanisms. So you want to get your offspring as far away as you can, especially trees are like this. You don't want to compete with your offspring for water or sunlight. So to get them away from you is actually probably best. And remember, plants are what we call sessile. They can't get up and walk away. And because they can't get up and walk away, wherever they land and wherever they germinate is really important that it's a good place. So there's all sorts of dispersal mechanisms. We have in dandelions here wind dispersal. You have samaras, which will float in the wind. Hitchhikers. So if you've ever been hiking or walking through dry grass and you find that your socks have little burrs on them, those are seeds. So you'll take them away. Impatiens. You can find them all around San Francisco. The large impatiens, they're an ornamental impatiens. I think it's New Guinea impatiens. When they get to the seed stage, they look like this, and if you touch it, they explode, and the seeds just will explode all over. You can get an animal to do it for you. So plants don't make fruit because they like us. Plants make fruit, so we'll disperse their seeds for them. We'll talk more about that when we talk about mutualisms. Or water, coconuts float, and they get away that way. So what effect does habitat have on life history? So these are the theory of R and K selection. So these are general life history strategies based on the environment. They're from the 1970s from MacArthur and Wilson. And you would have guessed they're based on the population growth models. R, remember, little r, that would be exponential growth. And K for carrying capacity would be logistic growth. And this is a theory of the environments. Environments can shape the life history of the organisms, and environments can in fact favor organisms with either density-dependent or density-independent growth. So our selected habitats tend to be habitats where the majority of the organisms have exponential growth. They tend to be limited only by their ability to reproduce. Remember, that is exponential growth. So the only limit on the rate of growth for organisms undergoing exponential growth is their ability to reproduce, or how fast they can reproduce. These are habitats that are either unpredictable or short-lived. They're very ephemeral, what we call ephemeral habitats. So if you look down here, this is post-fire, so that's fireweed. And after a fire, that is an ephemeral habitat before all the trees grow back in. And invasive species, well, zebra mussels here we often think of as ephemeral habitats, mosquitoes, pest species, like the weevil here. These are species that undergo rapid population growth with little competition. All right, so remember, just like exponential growth. These tend to be semiparous, so they tend to have one reproductive event and have a lot of offspring, little parental care. Classic semiparous species, and a lot of clonal growth. So these would be habitats, and the habitat is affecting life history of the organisms. As opposed to selected habitats, which are those habitats which have a carrying capacity. So the carrying capacity, remember, is how many individuals an environment can support. These tend to be crowded habitats with a lot of competition. Older habitats. So these are habitats that are pretty stable and steady, so the organisms can reach their carrying capacity. There's an ability to get that far. Little random environmental fluctuations. The animals tend to be larger, and the reason for that is there's a lot of competition. And if you're larger, you compete better in general. These species tend to be iteroparous, or have many reproductive or several reproductive events per lifetime. But they only have a few offspring, and they really take care of them. So they have a lot of parental care to make sure those few offspring do very well. Let's see. So they have larger, fewer offspring with more parental care. And this is due to the fact that these are habitats with intense competition. So R and K selection. In general, R selected habitats, the populations are controlled by birth rates. And in K selected habitats, populations are controlled by mortality because of the intense competition.